Well, as we begin, I want to remind you of where we have arrived in Matthew's gospel. I feel like something of a tour guide. Look, kids, Big Ben. Look, kids, Big Ben. I keep pointing back to Matthew 5:17. It is a monumentally foundational passage that helps us understand and interpret where we are right now. So remember, in Matthew 5:17, we learn that Jesus came not to get rid of, to bring to an end, to abolish the law and the prophets, the entire Old Testament, but to fulfill the Old Testament, to bring it to its intended completion, its intended fulfillment. All the promises made, He will keep. Now, after we learn that, Jesus, for the rest of Matthew 5, will give us 6 examples of how He does that specifically, how He brings the law and the prophets to fulfillment. In each of the 6 examples, He will either quote the Old Testament directly, He does it in some, not all, or He will quote, you need to pay attention, there's massive misunderstanding here, or He will just quote the teaching of the scribes and Pharisees of His own day to compare the true meaning of the Old Testament that He's bringing out versus the false teaching of the scribes and Pharisees. So what Matthew 5 is about is not Jesus just doing, that's what the Old Testament said, now I'm saying something new. That's not what's happening. Jesus is comparing the wrong teaching of the religious professionals of His day with what the Old Testament was really all about all along that He's going to bring out for us. Now, why does He do this? Because for far too long, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Jewish priests, they taught, interpreted, and led all the people in just mere external conformity to the Old Testament laws. And by not crossing these lines or committing those sins physically, actually, they thought, I am righteous. While the internal life was wholly neglected. Jesus, in all 6 of these examples, reaches far deeper. Just like the Word is living and active, goes down to the core of who we are, Jesus' teaching will do the same. And so, He goes beyond the letter of the law to the heart and the spirit of the law. And in this way, we get an idea, an understanding of what true righteousness really looks like. That's mentioned in verse 20, right? Because if we want to get to heaven, we have to have a righteousness greater than the scribes and Pharisees. Well, what's that look like? We are now beginning to see in these 6 examples for the next 6 weeks, Lord willing, what all this righteousness looks like. One more comment. In each of these 6 examples, Jesus has one repeated refrain that He will say. You have heard that it was said, but I say to you. But I say to you. He does it 6 times in Matthew 5. That He does this shows us He is very glad and willing to set Himself up as the authority of what Scripture teaches. You've heard it said like this, but I say to you. This is again either the most arrogant man in history or what He's saying is actually true. But I say to you. This is the very Son of God teaching us the very Word of God. So we come to the first example today in Matthew 5, verse 21 to 26, where Jesus will teach us, it's so practical and relevant for us, He'll teach us about murder. Some of you are like, what? Murder? What does murder have to do with me? I'm not a murderer. Well, you are. And Jesus is going to explain how we all are all of of us called out by this. In his book, Good and Angry, David Powlison begins with this sentence: "We have all firsthand experience with anger gone wrong. We've dished it out. We've been on the receiving end. We've heard and seen others get angry at each other. At some point every day, you are affected by some form of anger gone bad, either your own or someone else's." So therefore, anger touches all of us. It's a reality that affects every single one of us. This is true however you get angry. We get angry in different ways. You know this, right? There's generally 3 ways that people get angry. Some of you get angry like a gunslinger. Something happens and you just wham! And you're ready to go and you lash out quickly. There's no real thought. It just happens. That's you. Your anger is very quick, outburst. Others of you get angry like a volcano. You're slowly just brewing and bubbling under the surface. You can feel your blood pressure rising. Parents, you get this. And then all of a sudden, it gets near the top and you start seeing evidence and symptoms that something, oh no, so Dad's gonna blow. And then it happens, there's an eruption of anger. Still others of you, though, you're not the gunslinger, you're not the volcano, you're the iceberg. This is the passive-aggressive person who on the surface of things, everything looks small, controlled, still. But if you just look below the surface, there is a dense, massive, hoarded up pile of resentment that affects, under the surface, everything that you do and everything that you say. Anger affects all of us. Whether you do any of these 3 ways or you're a combination of all 3 of these ways at various kinds, all this is just a way to express irritability, argument, bitterness, resentment, self-righteousness, sarcasm, withdrawal, or violent outbursts. Wherever you are, we need to admit it, we have a problem. What do we do about this? One humorous way to solve the problem, though it's very understandable, Jonathan Edwards, the Puritan of the 17th, 18th century, he wrote resolutions as a young man. He's 19 years old. In his resolutions, he revealed he struggles with anger. One of them, he started everyone resolved. Like, I'm decided to live like this. One of them was resolved never to get angry at inanimate objects. And you're like, there's a story behind that one, clearly. But this is true. We have an issue. Thankfully, Jesus has much to say on this. And so our text is very pertinent to us. There's many ways to come at it, to understand it, to apply it. I've separated it in half. First, we'll look at the heart of anger in verse 21 and 22. And then second, we'll look at how to deal with anger in a specific context in verse 23 to 26. So follow along as I begin our text, verse 21 and 22, the heart of anger. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder, and whoever murders will be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother will be liable to judgment. Whoever insults his brother will be liable to the council, and whoever says, you fool, will be liable to the hell of fire. Well, Jesus begins in this first example of his fulfilling the law, the Old Testament and prophets, by quoting literally the 6th commandment. The This first part, you shall not murder, we can find it in Exodus chapter 20, verse 13. It is verbatim, a quote from Exodus 20:13, the sixth commandment against murder. But you notice he adds something to it. You have heard that it is said, you shall not murder, but then he says, and those who do will be liable to judgment. Where is that found? You won't find that specific quote anywhere in the Old Testament. You'll find the penalty of death mentioned all over the place in the Old Testament. But what Jesus is doing here after quoting Commandment 6 is he's quoting the understanding of his own day taught by the scribes and the Pharisees. And so, as we've said, the common way that this commandment was taught was that one only broke the commandment when actual murder was committed. This is what the scribes and Pharisees were teaching, and that's what's given to us here in verse 21. But in verse 22, we find Jesus giving us the true understanding of the sixth commandment against murder by speaking of anger. By speaking of anger. By doing this, Jesus fixes our attention on the motives, the attitudes, the postures, the inclinations of the soul that actually can lead to physical murder. He even applies the same penalty to anger that murder does. He says anger towards a brother makes one liable to judgment. We get that. Anger brings one before the council, which in their day was a very important judgment seat where one was examined and exposed for crimes done or sins committed. Likely, this is the council of the Sanhedrin, which is entirely ironic because he's calling out the Sanhedrin for their misinterpretation of the law while quoting their own judgment seat, but ultimately says that anger can bring one to the hell of fire. All this means to Jesus, anger towards another is as offensive and as inexcusable as murder. So that's the main idea that he's getting at. But we might wonder, how does he make this case? Like, how does he prove this true? How is this true? Well, he's going to tell us using something about us that we use every day that kind of reveals our murderous hearts. He's going to talk about our speech. He brings up our speech, and he says that whoever angrily insults someone or calls someone a fool will be liable to judgment. The word insults in the Greek, the original Greek, is the word rakah, which can be translated, I think, with our modern equivalent, idiot. That's what rakah means. While the word fool in Greek is the word moros, which is obviously where we get our modern word. How often do you get to say that in church? All together! It's where we get the word moron. So, rakah and moros, idiot and moron, taken together, used against another person, is meant to insult the whole of that person. Their being, their nature, their value, their worth, and basically implies that such a person that receives these insults is worthless and like the scum of all scum. That's what's in view here. These words reveal the posture of hearts, the thoughts we nurse against others, thoughts that Jesus would call murderous. Why does Jesus talk like this? Have you ever, this is hard. This is right on the nose of things. It's like, why Jesus? I mean, this is, ouch, right? Why do you have to do this? His whole purpose here is to show how the sixth commandment, Exodus 20:13, has all of what we've talked about in view. that it's comprehensive. It's not just about not crossing lines physically and actually murdering someone. It has that in view, but it also has, with the external, the internal things in view. Jesus says this looks at the whole of man, not just at something you're not supposed to do. I don't think this should surprise us for two reasons. First, we've heard Jesus talk like this time and time again all over the Gospels. One example, later on in Matthew chapter 15, we will hear Jesus say, "What comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. This is what defiles a person. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, adultery, immorality, theft, false witness, slander, and murder. This is what defiles a person." So while the world will tell us that the world around us is bad and evil, and that you in your heart, follow your heart, it's so pure and good, it's like it looks like Easter inside your heart, full of pastels. There's no Halloween going on in there. It's all bright and candy and flowers and daffodils and stuff. That's the heart. How pure is the heart? Jesus will say, inside the heart of every one of us lies a violent, murderous streak that expresses itself not only in physical acts of violence, but with thoughts, motives, inclinations, words that betray its existence. So we know this is true from what Jesus says first. Second, we could also say, I think we know this to be true from our experience. I mean, most Christians, unless you're just really unhealthy, you're in a bad spot, most Christians really want to love God and love God's people. And yet, when one of God's people, or you're with God's people, and maybe you're in traffic and someone cuts you off, or someone in public says something against you that's very rude or very offensive, you feel all those things bubbling up. You feel the disdain, the scorn, the vitriol start to brim. At least that's me. I feel like I'm the volcano that can kind of just like, and sometimes it's a short volcano, sometimes it's a big one, depending on what's going on in life. But when that happens, just examine your anger. You who want to please the Lord, are those thoughts and purposes within you pleasing to the Lord? Will God ever look at you in that moment and say, you're in line with the sixth commandment, with what you're thinking about doing to that person? No. These are wicked, vile thoughts. These are the ingredients that form the on-ramp to murder. And so if we're honest with ourselves, the verdict is clear. We are, all of us, guilty, and we're murderers in heart and mind. Our anger shows this to be true. But maybe you're thinking, well, doesn't the Bible say anger is not always bad? I'm like, yeah, anger is not always bad. Paul does say in Ephesians 4, be angry and do not sin. Anyone figured that out? If you do, let me know. I'd love to experience that with you. Jesus is the better example here. Every time he gets angry, he got angry a lot, he always gets angry for the right reasons and expresses his anger in the right ways. So he comes into the temple that should be a place of worship, sees corruption, religious, political power moves happening, and flips the tables. Jesus goes to the tomb of his friend Lazarus in John 11, looks into the dark black depth of the cave, and it says two words, Jesus wept. You're like, what's that to do with anger? The word wept there in the original Greek is used in other spots of the New Testament and is translated as anger or rage or fury. So Jesus is angrily weeping at the tomb of Lazarus? Yes, because he's raging at the consequences of sin and what they bring to people in this world. And not to mention the many times the religious leaders made Jesus angry. He heals a man on the Sabbath. A man is restored to health after years of unhealth, and the religious people are like, you can't do that. These are right things to get angry at, and he always expresses it in a right way. We, 99.9% of the time, I would say, are not like that in our anger. We might get angry over right things, but we express it in wrong ways. We might get angry over the wrong thing and express it in a kind of right way. Or we just might be wrong everywhere and be unjustified in all our anger. And so the main thrust to see here with the sixth commandment Jesus is teaching us is that just because we've not actually murdered another person physically does not mean that we are living in obedience with God's law. If you've been angry with another, you have murdered them in your heart and in your mind. What then does obedience look like to the sixth commandment? Well, this is just a general rule I think we use with every commandment, and even outside, just in regular life, this is a good general principle, rule of thumb to live by. Whenever you find a vice prohibited, you ought to pursue the opposite virtue. Whenever you find vice prohibited or commanded against, you ought to pursue the opposite virtue. The opposite virtue is commended. So murder, no. Life, commended. So therefore, obedience to the sixth commandment is far more than just not murdering, and even far more than just not getting angry at another person. It's esteeming, valuing, honoring, and respecting human life wherever it is found, regardless what that life does to you. That's the rub where anger can come in. That's the main idea, the heart of anger that Jesus is teaching us as he unfolds the true meaning of the sixth commandment. But that means something. It means we ought to change how we live. Because that's true, what then about our lives has to change? Well, Jesus tells us in the rest of our passage, verse 23 to 26, dealing with anger, how to deal with anger. Listen to how the passage ends. So if you're offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're going with him to court, lest your accuser hands you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you be put in prison. Truly I say to you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. Notice, out of all that he could have chosen, the context to explain how we deal with anger and being at odds with others, Jesus chooses the context of worship. You see that? He speaks of a gift, an offering. He speaks of an altar, of putting that gift on the altar. This is the context of worship. Worship to the Christian is the flame of life. It's not just, I know God, I believe the right things. That's not the Christian heart. It's, I know God and believe God's word, and I love this God because He has revealed Himself to me as Creator, and now I know Him by His grace as Redeemer. And He's my defender. He's my friend. I know Him. And I praise Him with all my life. Living sacrifices we are to be in Romans 12. That's a worshipful description of the entire Christian life. Worship, therefore, is not just singing a group of songs. Oh, how was worship today? Well, I'm still doing it. I mean, we get what you mean, right? If it's not just song, it's not just hearing a sermon. Worship is all of life for the Christian that never ends. It's this context that Jesus will speak of when we are worshiping. Notice what He says. He doesn't say, if you remember that you're at odds with someone, but He speaks of the other person. If you remember that your brother has something against you, that's different. Leave your offering on the altar, go and be reconciled, then come back to worship. Then come back to worship. So what does it mean, a brother has something against you? It means anger. It means relational strife. It means another is at odds with you. It's been undealt with, unconfessed, and that other brother is likely harboring resentment, and it's building up like that iceberg or volcano, or just you're not around, and so he can't be or she can't be the gunslinger. But you've clearly gotten yourself into a situation where there's relational conflict at odds, and now God says He would be more pleased if you stop worshiping, go reconcile, then come back. This has massive implications for how we view this. Jesus teaches us that our anger against another or a group or even another's anger against us disturbs worship to such a severe degree we ought to leave that worship setting. In other words, it's far more important to be reconciled with one another, especially in the same congregation, than to just go through the external motions of worship as if you're all okay. Theologian A.W. Pink commented on this passage saying this, so helpful. Before bending the knee in prayer, remember that you are drawing near unto Him who is as much the Father of your offended brother as He is yours. God will not receive you while you continue to worship under the influence of a malicious spirit. Jesus even goes further. You think that's hard? Jesus goes further at the end of the passage in verse 25 and 26 and says you ought to be so urgent in reconciliation that it shouldn't just be a, well, as the situation arises kind of thing, like I haven't seen them in a minute, like they're at the first service, I'm at the second service, or vice versa, or, I go to evening service, I avoid the morning because I'm not sure which one they're gonna be at, but when our paths cross, we'll talk, maybe, if we're getting coffee at the same time, and I look that direction. No, he says, do it immediately. Because if you don't do it immediately, dire consequences could occur. That's what it means in the whole language about as you're going to court, so the relational conflict has risen to such a degree that now there's a lawsuit with a judge involved, and that judge might hand you to a guard, that guard might just lock you in a cell. So reconcile immediately. This is an urgent matter. There are two ways we should talk about this, two ways to understand verse 25 and 26. I think both are true. I don't think you should arrive on either option as like the only option here. Many see verse 25 and 26 as metaphorical. Like it's a figurative, like it's an illustration to talk about a general truth, meaning our unconfessed and undealt with anger ultimately will bring us before God, the just judge of all the universe, who will then send us to hell for such anger and relational odds that we didn't deal with. I mean, James 2:13 says God will judge without mercy those who show no mercy. So that's one way to look at it. Others view 25 and 26 a bit more simply, just a general principle that this teaches it's far better to come to terms with those you're at odds with sooner, because if you wait till later, generally the consequences will be greater for everybody involved. If we just look at it that way, Jesus is just giving us really good advice. But if we see this metaphorically, I think we understand that Jesus' words here, how do we deal with anger? We prevent it like this, lest we have to face the judge and then reveal an unconverted heart and get sent to hell. The bottom line is this here, church. The sixth commandment teaches that God holds us accountable for our external actions of physical violence, as well as our internal postures that create such external actions. This is the radical and revolutionary nature of the kingdom of Christ. It goes deeper than what those religious people were teaching back in his day. Far deeper, to the center of who we are. So here's a hard question for you. Right? We're not just, I hope you're not, just doing the Christian thing here. I'm coming to church. I need to hear a sermon. I need to sing. I need to pray. Or follow along with someone else praying. We need to hear this and live it out. So, hard question. If Christians actually believe this, how many churches would be temporarily emptied on Sunday mornings? The coffee shops would be loaded full. Have you ever done this? If you've never done this, either you're living in disobedience because you're not willing to leave worship to go reconcile with a brother, or you're perfect. Or maybe the one you're at odds with is me, and you can't do it during a sermon. That'd be weird. This is no joke. Anger towards others that we allow to exist, that's the key. Undealt with, unconfessed, unhandled, diminishes, lessens, disturbs worship. So, I mean, just ask a practical question. Oh, I didn't get much out of worship today. Okay? Why? Maybe it's not us. Maybe it's you. Oh, I'm not living in great levels of assurance with my faith these days. Maybe that's because you're walking in low levels of obedience. You will not walk in high assurance if you're living in low obedience. Worship is at stake, the fountain and joy and delight of a Christian's life. I don't know what can make a Christian move more than saying worship is at stake. Reconcile with your brother or sister so worship can be restored. What does that reconciliation look like? It looks like doing hard things, like owning sin, owning wrong done, acknowledging fault, apologizing, asking for forgiveness, making peace, peacemaking. And after all that hard work has been done, you need to do more hard work and extend the same grace and mercy that you were given in the gospel to the one that offended you, or the one that finds you so offensive. And then maybe, if you start to live in this way, you can actually come to worship without leaving it, because you're not at odds with anybody, and you will become a person who's not so quick to anger, but you'll be like God, slow to anger. I'm sure some of you are thinking after all this, gosh, come on, Pastor. It's just anger. Like, geez. Did he have breakfast? Like, what's going on? It's only human to get angry. I'd agree. It is human to get angry, but anger is never innocent. As if it's like neutral or just always good and justified. Today we have seen the lethal streak, the murderous nature of the human heart, and we need to face the label and identity. I mean, have you ever done this? I am a murderer. What does that do to the heart? Wonderful things. Because it shows you the depths of the grace of the gospel more and more. Jesus was tested, accused, betrayed, denied, spit on, beaten, mocked, scorned, killed unjustly. We have no right in our anger to be angry, because none of our anger, generally 99.9% of the time, is just. Jesus is the only one who ever had a right to be perfectly angry and to lash out in his anger in a righteous manner. And he could have done so, but he chose a different way, submitting to the will of the Father in experiencing the wrath and anger of man to such a point that he was executed unjustly. Because he chose this way, we have hope. Hope that we can be saved from God's anger, hope to be saved from our own anger, and hope by grace and the power of the Spirit to become men and women who are slow to anger and not so triggerable in a trigger-happy world. This morning, as I was wrapping this up, I always save a chunk of the sermon for early Sunday morning. Let it marinate for a minute. I went on YouTube and I searched for something I've never searched before. You know how you fill in that search bar at the top and it like auto-populates what you searched for before? I searched for how to, lots of stuff came up. How to overcome, not much came up. Anger, nothing came up. I was like, well, it's new search. And there were tons of options there. I wanted to see, like, what does the world do with this? Like, how does the world answer anger? And I was like, okay, this is like 1,000 views, like 20,000 views. I want like the billion view video. So I went over to the filter and clicked view count, most. You know the top 2 videos on YouTube right now are, well, I think they're still there, about how to overcome anger, what they teach. One is like an hour, one is like 6 minutes. I listened a little bit to the 6-minute one, and it just said that anger is not really anger, it's just you're depressed. And I was like, oh, great, I got 2 issues now. And I don't know what to do with either one. Made me more angry. That's how I interacted with it. I'm sure there's a healthier way to respond to that video. The second one was even more confusing. It talked about how anger is just the result of us not doing the hard work to create more positive energy around our persona. You have negative energy, therefore you are going to be angry. Make more positive energy. And I'm like, how do I do this? You know what's it's funny. We ought to laugh at such folly, but it's tragic that if you go to the bookstore in the Christian section and look at like the top 10 sellers, you'll find all that thought present in like the top 5. Christians are buying this junk when Jesus teaches us how to deal with our hearts. Jesus teaches us the gospel only. Only the gospel is honest about anger. Only the gospel teaches that we're part of the problem. Only the gospel teaches us that anger against us might always be justified because we're all sinners. And only the gospel teaches us that others' sins against us are not as great as our sins against God. Only the gospel teaches this. And only in the gospel is our anger confronted and comforted by grace. Only in the gospel is our anger met by love. And only in the gospel is our anger mastered by a Christ who is slow to anger. Sin is always the problem. The gospel is always the remedy. There's a children's song I want to finish with. I'm not going to sing it. I'll quote one line in it. It's a Sovereign Grace children's song. I think it's Sovereign Grace. It's just called Peace. And in it, it just puts this right in view. How does a Christian deal with his anger? If Jesus can calm the sea, he can calm the storm in me. Jesus is always the answer.